All right. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us on Facebook for this special presentation of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. We're thrilled to have Worshipful Brother Steve Barrell with us tonight. Steve is past master of Mosaic Lodge 762 and current master of State College Lodge 770 here in North Carolina. And Steve has a fascinating presentation on Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park in New York City, of all places. So Steve's going to tell us how it got there and a little bit more about it. So this is a very interesting presentation. I've seen it before, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it again. So Steve, without further ado, it's all yours.
All right, now I assume everybody can see me, and when I go to share the screen, that will automatically happen. So do we have I do invite questions when I'm speaking, if you want to stop and ask a question. I first want to say that I only found out that I'd be doing this just over an hour ago, and I haven't given this presentation in about a year and a half. So I'm going to kind of be maybe fumbling a little through it because it's not fresh in my mind, but I think it'll go fine. It's a fascinating story about Masonry, a fascinating story about this incredible project that was actually almost inconceivable, and about the history of the United States all rolled into one. So I guess at this point, I'll just share my screen and get started. So many of you may know that there is, behind the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, an obelisk that is nicknamed the Cleopatra's Needle. It's 70 feet tall. It weighs 220 tons. It is the oldest artifact in the city. It's 3,500 years old, and it's from ancient Egypt. I mentioned it's 220 tons. That is one piece of granite, Aswan granite, and it was transported from Alexandria to New York in 1880. And so this is the saga of the so-called Cleopatra's Needle, and the man who made it possible, whose name was Lieutenant Commander Henry H. Gorringe.
Steve, I don't mean to interrupt you. Your screen is not sharing, so I'm wondering if...
Okay, hold on. Okay, then you should have... All right, let's go back and share screen. So, sharing now?
Perfect. Looks great.
So there's the needle from an old postcard from about 1900 probably. And this is Lieutenant Commander Henry H. The H stands for Honeychurch Gorringe. Let me get my presenter view. Here we are. Okay. So what is an obelisk? It is one piece of stone. That means monolith. And it is a certain shape. Typically always the height is 10 times the base. The Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. is obelisk shaped, but believe it or not, it's not actually an obelisk. It's not an obelisk because technically an obelisk has to be one piece of stone. And the Washington Monument has an iron structure that is encased in stone. So they're usually made of yellow or red Aswan granite. Typically were built from 1950 BC to about 900, so about 1,000 years. And they're tapered with a quadrangular or square base. The length is 10 times the width of the base, points up, and it is held in place only by gravity. And this little thing at the top is called the pyramidion. And the obelisk was a way that the ancient Egyptians symbolized the rays of the sun. Because oddly enough, you know, it's hard to believe that the people actually worshiped light in those days. Go figure. It was often gold-plated and was considered the skin of the gods. So the word obelisk is Greek, obeliskos. It means a spit or skewer because of the shape. The Egyptian name for it was Tekhenu, but the meaning of that word is not known as to what its significance was. But the little pyramidion at the top was called Benben. And the reason it was called Benben, let's see if this is here, yes, is because in the creation story in Egypt, the world was formed first of water. And the Benben was the first piece of earth that stuck up out of the primordial waters. And that's where the creator god Atum settled. The Egyptian capital city in Greek was called Heliopolis, Helios' son and Polis' city. And that was the home of their principal temple in 35,000 years ago. Now, obelisks were made without tools. This is an unfinished obelisk at Aswan. It's about 1500 BC. It's unfinished because there were structural flaws, and they recognized that that they would never have been able to erect it in one piece. It is longer, much longer than the one in New York, 137 feet. In fact, for those of you who know Raleigh, North Carolina, it's just 35 feet shorter than the NC State Bell Tower. And the weight of this, had it been erected, would have been 2,400,000 pounds. The way that it was made was left there. These small round stones of dolomite were used to pound and chip away at the granite. It was shown in some tests that in 12 hours, a single laborer could remove approximately 1/4 of an inch of granite from an area about 1 inch square. So they had obviously, as you can see the niches in this, they obviously had a good number of people sitting and working hour after hour, pounding away at this to loosen it. Obelisks were typically inscribed with hieroglyphs in praise of the gods and the pharaohs. Pyramids preceded obelisks, and they were burial chambers and memorials. But later on, pyramids became just too difficult to build. And so the obelisk reflected the top of the shape of the pyramid, but they were more sacred symbols of worshiping the sun gods. And they very often stood in pairs on either side of temple entrances. Now, this is a reconstruction of the temple at Luxor as it had looked at the time that it was fairly new. And you see these two columns here. It was perhaps not unfamiliar to Moses and the Egyptian and the Israelites who were kept in Egypt that temples would have columns, which might explain why Jachin and Boaz were inspired by obelisks. Now, why would Freemasons care about Egyptian things? Well, if you go back to the first Anderson's constitutions of 1723, in the history, there are 5 sections, and the first section is the history of Masonry, and it reports that there's evidence of ancient Freemasonry that goes back to Egypt. And that's when we say in some of our rituals that Masonry is ancient as having existed from time immemorial. And so it would be, if there were ever any evidence that this were true, it would be met with tremendous jubilation in Masonry if we would discover actual Masonic emblems or working tools in an ancient Egyptian structure. So this is a text that, this is the text out of Anderson's constitutions where it speaks about the actual text is there. And no doubt the royal art was brought down to Egypt by Mitzrayim, because we find the river Nile's overflowing its banks soon caused an improvement in geometry, which subsequently brought Masonry much into request. Later on in history, obelisks were also prominent in Masonic circles. This is a print that had to do with the repeal of the Stamp Act. In 1766, a large paper obelisk bearing the names of many of the prominent and wealthy citizens of Boston, including Masons, was erected under the Liberty Tree there to protest the Stamp Act of 1765. So much for being a quiet and peaceable citizen. The obelisk was lit from within with candles and torches and decorated with fireworks that unfortunately ignited and destroyed it on the spot. But what is interesting about this is a print showing the portraits of the men who had signed it and their initials and such. And this engraving, if you look at the lower hand right corner, you notice that the engraver is one Paul Revere. By 1766, he had already been a Mason for 6 years. And in 1766, he was senior warden of St. Andrew's Lodge. 3 years later, he was made master, and in 1794, Grand Master. This is the Egyptian Lodge room at the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia that dates from 1873. All of the hieroglyphs in this room are authentic hieroglyphs. They're not just pretty pictures, although they don't actually tell the kind of story you would expect. So you're seeing this Egyptian theme coming through history and being very important. 1873. Now, this is a map, a panorama of New York in 1879. And before I can tell the saga about the Cleopatra's Needle, we need just a little background into the times. Excuse me. What was happening in New York at that time that influenced the acquisition of the needle also influenced the construction of the Statue of Liberty, the New York Metropolitan Museum, and the Brooklyn Bridge. And if you see in that picture, you can see this absolutely enormous depiction of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was under construction, but it makes it look there like it crosses half of Manhattan. And this is, in this little island here in the front is Liberty Island with the star on which, or the pentagram on which the Statue of Liberty was still under construction in England. In France. So at this time, you can see how New York was building up with the wealth of the time and the growth of this country. Where the red arrow is now is Central Park, and where the obelisk would stand. And there, of course, is the Brooklyn Bridge. So here's a brief timeline of what was happening in the United States, because the obelisk saga didn't happen in a vacuum. This is from 1860. New York population was 813,000. Of course, with the War of Northern Aggression, also known as the Civil War, which past grand historian Stephen Campbell of North Carolina informs it was not a civil war, but a war of secession. And I think he's absolutely right about that. So here we are, 1865, the Civil War ends. At this point, Europeans were interested in coming back to the United States and emigrating and such. By 1870, New York's population is 942,000. 10 years later, 1.2 million. 10 years later, 1.5 million. 10 years later, it has more than doubled to 3.4 million people. And then by 1910, almost 5 million people living in New York City. In a 50-year span, the population increased sixfold. And this also meant that there was profitability, a lot of industry, and a lot of work. Some of the projects that were going on in New York at the time, the Brooklyn Bridge was begun in 1869. That was by the Roebling family, who were Germans. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was done. The Statue of Liberty was begun in 1876 and delivered on October of 1886. Metropolitan Museum opened in 1880 and was deemed immediately a world-class museum. And W.H. Vanderbilt completed his mansion in 1882. So there was a tremendous amount of industry going on in New York in what was called the Gilded Age. It wasn't until 1900 that the United States became the top industrial country in the world. But this time, from 1870 to 1910, was the Gilded Age. Now you can see the box that I just lit up, British brought an obelisk from England to London in 1877. Well, if the Brits transported an Egyptian obelisk to London, then the United States had to have one as well. And so this shows a distribution of Egyptian obelisks in Europe. You see that there are 4 or 5 in Rome that were actually brought there by the Romans. 1831, the French brought one. And then in 1878, the Brits got theirs. And so we had to have one because we were now a world-class country and city. It was really a case of anything you can do, I can do better. So here's New York, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Tower was going up 1875. And at this point, that was the tallest structure in the New World. The only 2 places that were taller were the Eiffel Tower and the Great Pyramid at Giza. The Paris obelisk was a yellow granite column that rose 75 feet high and weighed about 250 metric tons. And it celebrated Ramses II. Now, it was technically very limiting to transport it at that time. The French government in 1830s or 1820s ordered a special seagoing container to carry this. And the idea was that they were going to bring it out of the Nile, where 300 workmen would dig it up. And then I think I'm going to move ahead here because I think we actually have some pictures of this. You can see, of course, Manhattan developing there. Now, of course, the Brooklyn Bridge is minuscule by this point. But the French obelisk was a huge project that included 300 men having to drag this obelisk, putting it on something and bringing it. They brought it across the Mediterranean, around France, and then up the Seine and put it up right next to the Seine. So you always wanted to deliver it where you had to move a minimal amount. In 1880, New York was the home of 80% of the wealth in this country. This was the first big mansion in New York, Madame Restell. She was called Madame because that was her professional name. And this mansion was used professionally. It was what you call a house of prostitution, a bordello. And because of this, anyone who was anyone needed to have a mansion on Fifth Avenue. So this started happening. Here's the Carnegie Mansion. Then along came this, the Astor's Mansion. John Jacob Astor was the richest man in America when he died in 1848 from his trade in furs and real estate. And this is Lady Astor's drawing room. She was the grande dame of New York society. And regardless of how much money you had, no one would get into society unless she had decided that you were welcome. And this meant, for instance, that you would have to be invited to one of her costume balls, which lasted 3 days and which required you to have a multitude of very elaborate costumes in order to be accepted. This is Cornelius Vanderbilt's house. They made their money on railroads, as you know. This is William Henry Vanderbilt, the house on Fifth Avenue where Rockefeller Center now stands. And this is the Vanderbilt family. They built their house on Fifth Avenue, but Lady Astor regarded them as vulgar. If we go back to this house, you can't see it there, but there are statues that show women without tops, their tops covered. And so the Lady Astor was completely, she was just not going to have these awful vulgar Vanderbilt people in their society. But then W.H. Vanderbilt saw an opportunity to buy himself into New York society. He offered $100,000 today, in today's money, which would be about 2.3 million, for someone to be able to transport the obelisk that was in Alexandria to New York and set it up. And there were certain requirements. It had to be delivered within a year. And not one penny would be given to the person who was bringing it until it was standing up in its place in Central Park. Now, you would think that a 220-ton piece of stone, a third the way around the world, can just sit there because, you know, no, you're going to lose your shirt doing this. So here's the obelisk as it stood in Alexandria in 1878. It was stuck in the ground, surrounded by shacks, refuse, rubble. It was given technically to the United States by the Khedive because he was hoping to encourage more foreign investment. But he was rather unpopular and had to step down. When his son stepped up, the Egyptians were very angry that Egyptian monuments were being taken from the country. And so he tried to renege on the deal. This was already after the money had been offered to bring it to the US. So then fortunately, there was a written document from his father, the Khedive, saying that this was the Americans' obelisk. And so with a lot of diplomatic wrangling and bribes, permission was finally given to take the obelisk. But people in the United States were very concerned that it would end up somewhere horrible like Raleigh, North Carolina. It had to end up in New York. That was one of the stipulations. So if we go back and look at the history of this obelisk, here it was in 1737, along with another obelisk that had fallen down. And here it is in 1879 in a photograph, and notice that the other obelisk is missing. That is the one that's on the ground on the left is the one that ended up in London. It was much easier to transport it because it was already lowered. You didn't have to worry about this 200-ton object falling on you. And bringing it across water was the easiest way to do this. So they had, this is a model of the obelisks as they had originally stood farther down the Nile. They were actually brought around 37 BC up from their original place in Heliopolis. And this is what that place, that temple would have looked like. This is a model at the Metropolitan Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum actually has the Heliopolis temple in a special building there. So when that reopens, it's worth seeing. And this is how they brought it. There's Heliopolis in the green box, and they had to go all the way up the Nile to Alexandria, and that's about 20 BC, that the Romans did that. Cleopatra had nothing to do with it. So it just got the name Cleopatra's Needle because of the romance of Cleopatra in the 18th and 19th century. And this is the Temple of Dendur, which is the one at Heliopolis that is now in the Metropolitan Museum. So at this point, the news that America was going to get an obelisk started, and the World was one of the first newspapers. It was a big deal. Significant funds were available for its transport, and this was the petition asking for volunteers, people who believe that they can bring it. And one of the 6 applicants was Lieutenant Commander Henry H. Gorringe, United States Navy. Now, he came forward because he was well qualified. A little bit of his background. He was born in Barbados in 1841, and as a boy, he became very skilled at sailing on open water. He got bored of higher education, so at age 14, he took a job as a cabin boy on an ocean vessel. Essentially, he disappeared. The vessel was shipwrecked in the Indian Ocean. He was rescued, brought to India, and then found his way to Cuba, where he emigrated to the United States and enlisted in the Navy. In 1862, at age 21, he became commander of his own Union Navy ship, and he earned 3 heroic citations during the Civil War. After the war, he was made at age 26 lieutenant commander, And they assigned him to a desk job in Washington, D.C., where his job was to draw coastline maps and the depths of water so they would know where American ships could travel safely. He missed sailing very much. In 4 years of that, he begged, please let me go out to the ocean and at least get out to the sea. So they gave him an old Confederate paddle boat, a steamboat called the SS Gettysburg, which he personally rebuilt himself. When he got out to off the coast of Portugal, he discovered a very high ridge of underground mountains, which he believed were Atlantis. And they are even today called the Garringe Ridge near the Azores, and they're named after him. This is the image of the steam paddle boat that he was given and which he rebuilt. And there is a map showing the depths of the, and you can see, of course, Lisbon at the top is the capital of Portugal, and you can see the Straits of Gibraltar on the right. And you can see this Garringe Bank, and this, which he thought it was only a few hundred feet, only 100 feet from the surface of the ocean, so he thought this might have been Atlantis. Now, he was very good at making mechanical drawings and maps because of his work drawing coastlines, so engraving and such. So when he saw a little earlier in 1878, his ship, the Gettysburg, broke down in the Mediterranean. So he limped it to Alexandria to be repaired. And while he was having it repaired, he saw this obelisk. Now, this was a year before the announcement went out that they want someone to bring the obelisk. So he knew, what the situation was and such. And so the right man showed up at the right time. When the help wanted announcement went out in 1879 to transport the obelisk, it had his name written all over it. Move the obelisk. There were 6 applicants, but only Garringe properly described how he would do it. And this is what he said he would do. He'd find a ship that could house the obelisk inside it and could cross the Atlantic with it. He would determine how to safely lower the obelisk. He would design the obelisk lowering machinery, have it made in the US. In fact, it was made by the Roebling Company that was doing the ironwork for the Brooklyn Bridge, and transport it to both job sites, both at Alexandria and then again in New York, to erect it. He determined how he would move the 220-ton obelisk onto a ship. He figured out the depths of the Alexandria port in order to determine a safe route, and during that, not incidentally, discovered other ruins that had not been known to be there. He determined how he was going to move the 50-ton base into the ship, which is a huge block. So it won't fit, for instance, the way you can stick a pencil point first through something. Then he would cross the Atlantic, find a suitable mooring place in New York to transfer the obelisk onto land, figure out how to get the obelisk across a large landmass. Now remember, I mentioned both the London and Paris obelisks are very close to the rivers, so they didn't have to move it far. Unfortunately, as you'll see in a little bit, the place where it was determined that this obelisk had to be in Manhattan was in the middle of the island, about 2.5 miles from the landing place. He then had to figure out how to raise the obelisk vertically high enough so that it could be put on its base. So the first question he asked was, has any of this been done before? So he looked in the archives. This is at Vatican, and this is one of the obelisks. This one was brought to Italy. They don't know exactly when. Yes, they do know with this, when they brought this one. They don't know how the ones in Turkey got there. But this one stands in the middle of St. Peter's. But originally, and this is the aerial view, originally it stood where the red, it had stood all the way up in the upper left corner in a garden. And then it was later moved to the square. And fortunately, the people who erected it in the 1500s published a book about it. So they showed where it is on the left. They showed the machinery that they built with all the ropes and the pulleys that all the men together are pulling to raise the obelisk. And they showed there the obelisk is encased in wood or some sort of structure laying on the ground to keep it in one piece before they raised it. And the entire layout of all the teams of men who would be turning and pulling ropes all around the obelisk to raise it, and so on. So they had all this information. Now this is the Paris obelisk, and this was given to France in 1803 to Napoleon, but it wasn't moved till 1831. When the French finally did decide to get it, they decided they wanted not one, but three. And so they ended up bargaining and ended up just taking one of the only existing pair of obelisks in their original place at Luxor. And again, you saw this earlier. This is the temple at Luxor. And this is what it looks like today, with one exception. That's what it looks like today. They had taken the obelisk. This is what it should have looked like. And that's what they did. They just made off with one of them. And this is the way they moved it. They cleared away a village and created a flat place in order to drag the obelisk about 300 feet over to the edge of the Nile. And they had a ship that was going to bring it up the Nile. And they made this system. They used the other obelisk in order to cantilever the one that they were lowering. So you can see the one on the left is the one that remained. And so they gently lowered it. And that's what the mechanism looked. Very similar to the Italian one that you saw earlier with all the ropes. And then they put it on this ship called the Luxor, which they named. And they ran it aground so that the obelisk could be loaded right onto it. They wouldn't have to transport the obelisk across water. And then when they got it to Place de la Concorde in Paris, they made a ramp. You see the ramp on the left. And so they brought it slowly up the ramp, foot first, dragged it up, and then erected it. And at the bottom, they made a new granite base for it. And there's an important reason why it has a new base. I'll show you that in a moment. And they should tell the story of how it was originally set up. The original base was ornamented with baboons worshiping the sun. And you can see them there on the left. And on the right, the baboons are missing from the one that they took. Here's a close-up of the baboons. These are at the Louvre Museum. The reason they were not used at the base of the Paris obelisk was because they were anatomically correct. And the ladies of Paris would not allow such a thing. So they just decided to censor it, put it in the museum. And so there, it got a new base. This is the London Cleopatra's Needle. And it's the match to the one the US got. Now, as again, it was already laying down, so they didn't have to figure out how to lower it. And so what could be easier? It was next to the water. They just put it in a capsule. They dragged the capsule behind their ship from Alexandria out the Mediterranean, around Portugal and Spain, up into England, up the Thames, and then would unload it. So what could be easier? We'll leave it to the English. And this, by the way, is the one in New York. So you can see the similarity that they're matching. So here's what they did. They dug around the horizontal obelisk and put these metal frames around it that would be the structure to encapsulate it. And so after they did this, they sealed it all up like that. And the plan was that they would pull it behind the ship, which they named the Sphinx for this purpose. And so they are pulling it. It got off the coast of Portugal and there was turbulent water. The capsule turned upside down. So 6 men went to try to upright it, and they drowned. At that point, they were afraid that this capsule was going to actually pull them down, to pull the ship down to the bottom of the ocean. So they cut the chain and abandoned it. A private entrepreneur found it, knew what it was. He towed it back. He held it for ransom in England, said he wanted 5,000 pounds for it, and they offered him 2,000, and he took it. So based on all of this, Henry Honeychurch Gorringe knew a few things about how to move an obelisk and a few things about how not to move an obelisk. So he was familiar with ironwork. He knew how to navigate the sea in shallow waters. He'd seen the obelisk. He had considerable experience and the blessings of the United States Navy, who gave him leave. The New York Herald newspaper and W.K. Vanderbilt were all behind him. So now it was time to get to work. He engaged the Roebling factory to build the cantilever that he designed that would hydraulically lift and rotate the obelisk. And once dismantled, he shipped it to Alexandria, then assembled the hydraulic cantilever, and then would bring it back to use it to raise the obelisk again. He also had to find a suitable ship. So he went to England, Scotland, and Ireland, the great shipbuilding companies and countries, and could find nothing. He found a ship in England called the Desug. So he personally supervised its complete rebuilding, had the boilers relocated so the ship could accommodate the obelisk inside its hull. He then also, because he was an ocean cartographer, he then had to map the city port of Alexandria. And this is his map that he made so that he could figure out the safest route to bring this obelisk out. He did this in 1879 while his ship was being rebuilt. So now remember up to until now that the obelisk was stuck in the ground and nobody knew what was holding it up. They dug away about 10 feet of rubble and found that it was standing on a base that was roughly 10 by 10 by 7, a solid block of stone, and a platform consisting of 3 steps. Henry now realized that this foundation and large stone block were going to present additional and unexpected difficulties in transporting the obelisk. He had envisioned that the obelisk could be rolled into the ship through an opening near the front of the hull, but this bulky pediment would have to be lowered by crane from above through an opening in the deck. There is that pediment. So that is a huge block that weighs about 60 tons. So first he had to cantilever the obelisk, these photographs. So they encased it and prepared it for removal. Then they began tipping it, and they put railroad ties in order to cushion it as it would gently turn horizontal. Well, it turned out not to be so gentle. It actually came crashing down and broke a number of these ties and gave everyone around a horrible scare. But then it bounced and gradually stabilized. So the ship was ready. They were able to lower the hydraulics to bring the obelisk horizontally down. It was already encased in wood. So then they used round cylinders to move it to the ship, which was not far away, and inserted it in the hull of the ship. And this is a newspaper drawing of what it looked like. And he also knew that he had to anchor it, because if it were at all loose in the ship, it could capsize the ship. Now here was the other problem. The base, the block that weighed 50 tons, had to be lowered directly down into the ship through an opening in the deck. Problem was, they didn't have any cranes that could lift 50 tons. They had cranes that could manage 30 tons on land, and from a barge, 25. So they had to use both these cranes perfectly balanced in order to lower the block safely into the ship. If they missed, if either crane gave way or they had too much weight on either one, the block would go right through the ship. The way that he figured out how to do this was he marked on the barge by increments on the sides. He calculated the amount of displacement of water. So he set it for 23 tons, so that when the barge had lowered to indicate that it had 23 tons of weight on it, the rest of the weight was taken by the land-based crane, so that the displacement of weight on either side would vary very little, and it got a perfect distribution and got the thing into the ship. So you've heard a whole lot of stuff so far. What has any of this got to do with masonry, you may wonder? This is where it gets real interesting. Now that the obelisk was no longer standing on the base, they could examine the base and the platform with the 3 steps that it was standing on. Newspaper headline: "The Royal Art Report by the head of Egyptian Masonry, Zola's investigation deciphering the stones," and that reported that there were viewpoints of Masonic importance on the obelisk that evidenced that early symbolic masonry had existed before Christ. In the removal of the foundations, they found what they considered an ordinary mason's trowel made of iron or steel. The mortar or cement that the stone was standing on was of similar color, about the same hardness, and appears a slight depression was cut in the stone and trowel, which was embedded. So they found also a square, 2 granite blocks, one that was perfect and smooth and one that was not, which are perfect and rough ashlars, and a piece of white stone, all in the correct positions as Masonic emblems. And so at this point, they also found a piece of a plumb line. And so at this point, the Order of Freemasons in Egypt, all around the world, were extremely excited, because here was the evidence that masonry went back as early as pre-recorded history. So this was the report. I've basically given you the gist of it. In the removal of the foundations, there have been made what is considered very important historical discovery relating to the Masonic order. So in 1880, after this was all done, in 1880, a Mason named John Weiss in New York wrote a book about this, describing the obelisk and its influences and importance in Masonry. And so he described the 3 steps, which you see on the left, then there was a stone cut in the form of a right angle, a square. And he calls them various names, the Gorin stone. There you see the stone cut in the right angle. On one of the base parts, there was a rectangular parallelogram, 2 sides partially worked and partially finished and polished, which they were, and then the lower surface was, 2 sides were left in a rough state, which they interpreted as part of the fellow crafts degree, the unfinished and finished parts of the stone. There was another stone called the Gorin stone that had linear measures on it, which they thought was similar to the 24-inch gauge. And there you see this may be a tracing stone representing the labors of the 3 degrees, and also probably a sketch of the linear measure of those days. And then at the end of another piece of stone, they found the oxidized trowel, but they noticed a Masonically familiar shape that was carved. It says that you can see in the little emblems on the end of that stone, there's a square. So everybody was basically, dancing on air at this point, that old masonry is as old as this. And here it's a cube, its face is carefully dressed and finished. This stone, to my mind, represents the perfect ashlar. So this went on and on. And at one point, the question was, the Consul General of Egypt, the American, was brought in. He was a Mason, and he brought in the Secretary of State, who was also Attorney General and later a senator from New York. And they all had decided that this was the evidence of Masonry in ancient history. They brought in the Egyptologist, the most famous Egyptologist of the time, who was very lackadaisical about these interpretations and thought they were way out of line. But at this point, there was this Masonic fever going on. So now the obelisk has arrived without difficulty in New York. It did turn out that the ship's crankshaft broke at sea, but Gorringe was afraid that that would happen, and he had an extra one and replaced it. So they ran the ship aground in Staten Island across from Manhattan to unload it. Then they brought the obelisk by barge. And this is the west side next to the Hudson River. And the obelisk had to cross a railroad track. So they had to, and they made rails for the obelisk to be moved on. So for a little while, the steam engine trains had to be stopped. Now this is what, you can see the obelisk here behind the Metropolitan Museum, which was only 2 years old at the time. The blue arrow indicates the obelisk. This was taken probably about 1910, judging from the age of the cars. But what they had to do was transport the obelisk from the upper left corner where the black line begins, all the way through Manhattan, through the park, around to Fifth Avenue, and back around behind the museum, 2.5 miles. I did this on Google Measure Distance, 2.42 miles with this 220-ton stone. And when they got it to the park, because they had to raise it up higher in order to get it to cantilever onto the base, they had built this trestle system. They were able to move about 100 feet a day. It took 4 months to get this obelisk moved through Manhattan. Meanwhile, the base, the foundation for the base was going in. Here it is. And the cornerstone was laid in October of 1880. And when the cornerstone for this was laid, of course, it was a big deal to Masons. This is what we do. We lay cornerstones. And so a Masonic parade was gathered together to precede the ceremony for laying this cornerstone. You like parades? There were no photographs of the Masonic parade that took place in New York at this time. These are similar photographs of other Masonic parades and Knights Templar from other cities. The Grand Lodge of Manhattan, this was the Grand Lodge building at that time. And so they organized the Masonic parade to the cornerstone laying and organized that lodges should come in and, you know, march. Many of these lodges had military brass bands. So here's a map of New York from the time. The star is where the obelisk base was going to be dedicated. And way down at the bottom where you see all the red lines crossing, these are side streets, all of which were filled with Masonic lodges preparing to march up to the Fifth to the groundstone laying. And the Grand Lodge was down there at 23rd Street and 6th Avenue, so down where those lines are. So I don't think I can hear any of you, but this may in fact have been the largest Masonic parade that ever took place. 9,000 Masons participated. And so on the right hand, you see the, I guess, is that Knights Templar? That looks like St. Andrew. They're there. The pieces of the base are put in place, but they're getting ready to dedicate it. And on the left is the Grand Master of Masons of New York, dedicating the cornerstone for the base. And that incidentally happened on February 22nd which was George Washington's birthday. So some of the other, this was such a big deal. There was obelisk fever throughout the United States. I did a search on different newspapers that mentioned the obelisk, and there were over 1,200 separate articles in newspapers. You see there on the left, a special baton for the Grand Marshal was made, paid for by the owner of the New York Journal. It is 18-karat gold, brass, ivory, and has amethysts inset, and it is a replica of the obelisk. The Grand Lodge in New York has this on display. And so the Grand Marshal got to carry this around, and there are the inscriptions from the to the Grand Master from the editor of the or the owner of the newspaper. There were also special coins that were made, and these were given to children. Very valuable now if you can get a hold of one. So there was all of this obelisk fever everywhere. So here's the day. The Grand Master gets up with his speech. And I like to call him Grand Master Buzzkill, because he got up there with all this hoopla, and then he announces that we cannot honestly claim, because of such traces, that those societies or institutions were Masonic in their nature. So he basically got up there and said, no, the evidence that that Masonry was from before Christ is this is just exaggerated. And he just poo-poos the whole thing, which was a real buzzkill. Oh, there we are. There's the text. But he says we should not detract from the importance of these discoveries, but we should not be hastily deciding that they are conclusive. So, that said, shortly after that, the obelisk itself was put in place, cantilevered with the same machinery, and dedicated with about 20,000 persons in attendance. And this is it as it stands in the park today. And most New Yorkers don't even know it's there. But Henry Honeychurch Gorringe's work was not over. I didn't mention, but he was also a Mason. He wrote and published a magnificent account of his entire heroic endeavor that included about 50 of his own engravings of the maps and the machinery and everything, which you can find online at archive.org and Hathi Trust. Egyptian obelisks, and the outside cover is gilded. I'm still hoping to get a copy. I saw one sold for about $135. And the frontispiece is a photograph of a Vanderbilt who did cough up the $100,000. And so this was basically, he had to pay tribute. By the way, Vanderbilt was also a Mason. And so you can see the quality of many of these drawings. And that book, by the way, is quite large. It's probably about 18 by 14 inches, 18 by 12, of all of these very elaborate drawings. Now, on a personal note, with regard to Henry Honeychurch Gorringe, he died in 1884 at age 44. He jumped off a trolley or something, and it was still moving too fast, and he stumbled and struck his head, and he died a few days later. Now, in his eulogy, his best friend, who accompanied him on many of these adventures, said of him that Henry never said that something could not be done. He was fearless, and he would only ask, how shall it be done? His grave marker north of New York City, and there is his date of birth and death, born in Barbados, Henry Honeychurch Gorringe, a description of his works and such. So the reason I got into all this was because when I was in the early 70s, my grandfather, named Aubrey Honeychurch, had died, and I asked my grandmother if there is anybody in the family who had ever done anything remarkable. And she said, well, there's something about that obelisk behind the museum in New York. So when I became a Mason, I went to the Grand Lodge of New York, and I wanted to know if he was somehow related to me. The spelling of his name, Honeychurch, without an E, is the same way that my grandfather spells his name. Although if you notice the photograph underneath with a red arrow, they stuck the E in. The E does not belong there. So I continued to look into this, and what I did finally discover, well, he was born in Barbados. Well, my grandfather was born in Barbados. His father was the rector of St. Michael's Cathedral. My second great-grandfather was the clerk, the secretary for the cathedral. And his name was Henry Honeychurch. So it turned out that Henry Honeychurch Gorringe was baptized and named after my second great-grandfather. I cannot conceive that the rector's wife had been fooling around or something and that he is actually a blood relative, because her husband was the rector of the cathedral. But at least there was a connection, and it was rather nice to see. I'll skip through this because this little part was basically, this is where I just show the genealogy. My mom, her father, Aubrey, his father, Mitchell Graham, and his father, Henry, there on the right. And he was, as I say, the clerk of St. Michael's Cathedral. But this is what I really want to say about this. This is Brother Henry. Brother Henry never said it can't be done. Brother Henry just does it. Let's all be like Brother Henry. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm open for questions.
All right, Steve, thank you. That was fantastic. I always enjoy seeing that presentation. And anyone watching on Facebook, if you have any questions, just type them into the comments, and I'll be happy to ask Steve. And Steve, there's just a few seconds delay between this and Facebook, so it may take a second for questions to load in.
And I could also look at this on Facebook?
You can, yeah. And Alex Wilson asked, does that obelisk carved by Paul still exist?
I don't know anything about Paul. Who? Paul the Apostle?
McCartney? I'm not sure. I'm not. So Alex, if you're still watching, if you could clarify that question, maybe. And Worship Brother Moises Gomez asked what the name of the book was.
The name of the book is Egyptian Obelisks by Henry H. Gorringe, Gorringe. And you will find it on archive.org, Hathi Trust. You can download it in PDF.
And Brother Brad Strand asked, how was the machinery that raised the obelisk powered?
It was hydraulic. I would imagine it could have had either some kind of motor that would have run it, or it could have been manually done. I don't know. In fact, that answer may be in the book. That may be in the Egyptian Obelisks book.
All right. Any other questions?
He tells about everything how he accomplished everything. It was a tremendous feat. And it was he was the only person in the world who probably could have done all those things to chart the depths of the water and such. More questions? Well, if you get to New York, go visit the Grand Lodge of New York, go see the Grand Marshal's baton, but also go to see the obelisk. Let's see, I'm looking at it here on archive.org. Just, I don't know how I would find, they never had indexes in books in those days like this, so you just have to go and read about it, unfortunately. Although with PDF, you can do a word search.
Sean Patrick asked, any idea why the Grand Master of New York downplayed the Masonic connection?
I think he was right. I think he looked at it and he said, this is over exaggerated and I just cannot get up there and say something I don't believe in. I frankly, I can't blame him. I am looking at page 17 of the obelisks, and he talks about the pumps, the turning structure, troublesome, the piston of the pumps. He doesn't say how they were driven. Anyway, that would be on page 17 of the Egyptian obelisks book that discusses the machinery.
All right, fantastic. Well, Steve, I don't see any other questions rolling in, but that was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think everyone else enjoyed it. We got some good response there, some good feedback. So this will be posted on Refracted Light following this presentation, so anyone can go back and rewatch this. But Steve, once again, thank you for jumping in at the last minute here and delivering just a fantastic presentation.
I was honored to be asked, and that you thought of me, Brother Matt, at the last minute when, you were short there. And, I've got a few others. Similarly, I like stuff that's really fascinating. So if you ever have another opening, just let me know. It was a real honor, and I welcome questions or comments as a result of this or on anything else.
And
you'll have to have me talk about the afterlife. You know that, Brother Matt.
Yes, I was going to say, I would love for you to give that presentation where you play the EVPs. And
I'm the ghost investigator for the Ryan Research Center, which had been the parapsychology laboratory at Duke University at one time. So I know a whole lot about evidence for afterlife. So that already, there's the trailer. So,
well, we will definitely set up a date for you to come and give that presentation, because I would love to hear that. And if anyone's in Durham, North Carolina, Steve has a metaphysical library that he runs. And Steve, how many books do you have currently in your library?
3 arrived today, and I have 12,503 cataloged. So it'd be 12,506.
And he has an autographed Graham Hancock. So good stuff.
3.
You have 3.
Yeah, I also have an autographed book by J.B. Ryan, the pioneer in parapsychology, and 2 autographed Manly Palmer Hall books, maybe 3.
Wow.
So.
Okay, I assume they are not available for checkout.
I lend, most of the books I'll lend out. I'm trying to get some back now with this COVID thing. They go out quicker than they come in. So it's okay. I just hope they get paid forward. They get used and read. Well, thank you, brother. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody tuning in, and hope to see you Tuesday night when we have Brother Joe Martinez talking about the Osirian mythos and its connection to Freemasonry. So that should be another great historical presentation. And I think it really ties in well with this one, with the Egyptian obelisk, and then talking about the Osirian mythos. So, all right.
Good night then.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next Tuesday.